Will you?
Yes.
Almost 4 a.m. on Friday the 31st of August 1888. It's pitch black out, and John Neal, a police constable, is walking the streets of Whitechapel, carrying his little oil lamp, his only source of light in the dark streets. After stepping over some rubbish scattered across the pavement, he stops. He stops at the corner of Bucks Row, and again, there is a pile of something on the floor. At first he thinks it's a tarp. John is about to step around it when he looks a little closer. He shines his oil lamp on the bundle. This is not a pile of rags. This is a woman, legs spread out across the pavement. Lengthwise, her arms are by her sides with her hands empty open to the skies. Her skirt is pulled up to her knees, and her bonnet has fallen away. Her hair spills out over the stone pavement, mixing with something dark and moving. John looks closer. The woman's throat has been cut so deep.
Oh my God!
He leans back in shock. The cut is still bleeding, running out onto the street. John spins on his heels, and he's off down the street, only to return a few minutes later with Dr. Llewellyn, who lived just 300 yards away. The doctor set down his bag and kneeled by the body to start his examination. After a moment, he looks to John. This body's still warm. I'd say this could have only happened within the last half an hour. The doctor then pronounced life extinct, and at this point, another police constable appeared at the scene, P.C. Misen. Dr. Llewellyn asked both the officers to lift the body and place it onto the cart. We need to get her back to the dead shed, the Whitechapel mortuary. John thinks this is strange, as Dr. Llewellyn has no legal power to do this. Really, they should wait for the police inspector. But Dr. Llewellyn insisted, and also told the police to throw a bucket of water over the scene to wash away the blood. The next morning, at the Whitechapel Workhouse mortuary, Inspector Spratlin recorded the findings as Dr. Llewellyn informed him of the injuries.
Woman of 40 to 45 years of age. There are several injuries, including 2 deep cuts to the throat, both of which had penetrated down to the spine. The first cut was approximately 4 inches, 10 centimetres long, and the second was approximately twice the size, 8 inches, 20 centimetres in length and stretch from ear to ear, deep enough to sever the large artery. The cuts were framed by 2 small bruises to both sides of the jaw that were not unlike the impressions left by recent pressure of a thumb and finger, suggesting that the killer had held the woman's throat prior to slitting it twice. There were also a number of abdominal injuries thought to have been made with the same instrument, a strong bladed knife. One deep hacking gash had jaggedly torn the left side of the lower part of the abdomen and as far up as the sternum, leaving the intestines exposed. Similar cuts were found on the right side of the torso, including further slashes across the abdomen, but no internal organs have been removed from the body by the murderer.
Detective Spratling walked over the stone floor to the table by the wall to record the clothes and the possessions of the dead woman. He noticed that her clothing was marked with PR, meaning that it belonged to Princess Road Workhouse. Spratling then made a note at the bottom of the page and underlined it twice. A simple question: is she homeless? Someone from Prince Road Workhouse was sent, And as soon as they saw the body, they said straight away it was Mary Ann Nichols, or Polly to her friends. Monday, the 3rd of September, and the Times newspaper, eager to create hype to sell their newspapers, linked the similarities with Martha Tabram's death with that of Mary Ann Nichols, labelling them both as unfortunates, which back then meant they were working girls. So now the newspapers claimed that the victims were poor women who also worked as prostitutes. But there is no evidence at all that Polly was a prostitute. There's no warnings, no arrests, just the immoral panic within the Victorian society and the label forced upon her after her death by a newspaper. What you also need to bear in mind is the press at the time loved to glorify stories and whip up hysteria. As long as the papers sold, it didn't really matter what they printed. And papers were not released just once a day, but could be released 3 or 4 times a day, with the papers selling the most being the ones with the most graphic and grisly claims. But in the case of Polly's death, you read the newspaper's account and then the police reports, and straight away you can see things are not adding up. There is inconsistencies with what the police and the newspapers are both saying. People from the area were questioned, but no one heard a sound. The bruising on the face implies the killer struck from behind. Eluding nearby police in the area by minutes suggests that he knew the area very well, as Whitechapel at the time was full of little back alleys and dark little yards. Areas easy to lose police, especially in the dark of night. Polly was an educated, hard-working lady, and she and her husband William got permission to live in the new Peabody estate, which was new housing that was only for really hard-working, honest people. They were allowed to live there and had 5 children, but the husband said Polly became a drunk and started to sleep around. However, Polly's father, a blacksmith, says it was actually the husband William who was having the affair, and he had just been found out. So Polly leaves and moves into a workhouse taking the children. And as soon as she does, William, against his wishes, is forced to pay Polly a small allowance. But William knows, like most men of the time, there is a loophole to get out of paying any form of maintenance. And all you have to do is label your wife a prostitute or dependent on another man. Bruising on the face indicated a punch, and also indicated pressure from fingertips to hold the head back for her throat to be cut from ear to ear. The body was recorded to have intestines pulled out by the Ripper, but sources from the time indicate the body wasn't very well treated, and was roughly heaved from the ground and thrown into the back of a cart, where it was jostled around with the cart wheels on the cobblestones. So I would argue that this is maybe where the intestines became displaced, which will be important for what comes next. Saturday, 8th of September 1888, 29 Hanbury Street. Harriet folds a newspaper she was reading about yesterday's funeral of a young woman murdered on the streets of Whitechapel, Mary Ann Nichols. Harriet placed the paper on the table and turned to her son. "What's that commotion outside? Go and see what it is. See if it's a fire." A few moments later, the boy returned. "Don't upset yourself, Mother, but a woman's been killed in the yard, and a crowd has come to see the body." Harriet rushed to the yard to see. The yard was full of people standing around the body, touching it and moving things. Harriet heard more voices and turned to look back at her building, and nearly every window was open with multiple faces hanging out. The other residents of Hanbury Street were charging onlookers a few pennies to look out their windows down at the body. The body had been found by John Davis, who lived on the top floor of 29 Hanbury Street. He woke at around 5:45, as he was already up when he heard the Spitalfields church bells ringing the hour. John had a cup of tea and made his way down the stairs to the back door to use the toilet that was outside in a brick shed in the right corner of the yard. When he opened the door to walk outside, there was a body of a woman lay on her back at the bottom of 3 stone steps. John raced out of the yard to fetch a policeman and returned with Inspector Chandler. But by the time the inspector and John returned, there was crowds of people round the house, people waiting to go inside and look out the windows, others waiting to get into the yard, and a crowd of people standing around the body. Inspector Chandler from H Division recorded what he saw. There was a body of a female lay on her back running parallel with the fence that separated this yard from the neighbouring yard. The deceased's legs were drawn up and her skirts were above her knees. The body's intestines came out of the body and lay over the right shoulder with some pieces of skin. There was also some pieces of skin on the left shoulder. I sent for police surgeon Dr. Phillips and made sure no one else touched the body. There was a piece of canvas, a piece of coarse muslin, a small tooth comb, a pocket hair comb in a case, and they're all found stacked by the victim's feet. A part of an envelope with 2 pills inside was found by the victim's head. Dr. Phillips pronounced the victim's life extinct, and the body was then taken back to the mortuary. The doctor, George Baxter Phillips, recorded that she was 5 foot tall, blue eyes, dark brown wavy hair, excellent teeth, and strongly built. But the doctor did find a disease in the lung tissue, which was possibly TB, and he went as far to say that if she wasn't murdered, her death from this disease was imminent. The deceased was wearing a long black cloak that went down to her knees, a black skirt, 2 bodices, 2 petticoats, red and white woolen stockings, and a red and white neckerchief. And under the dress, close to the body, was a large pocket tied around the waist on string, that Dr. Phillips reported to have been torn. And it was from here that the items found stacked at her feet were taken from. But that also asks other questions. Was there anything else taken, apart from the 3 brass rings that were ripped from her middle finger on her left hand, and her reproductive organs? Was this the start of Jack keeping trophies, as nothing seemed to have been taken from Martha Tabram or Mary Ann Nichols? When the police questioned people in the area, a lodger next door living at 27, a carpenter by the name of Albert Kadosh, who had an infection which made him constantly go outside to use the outside toilet every 5 minutes. Kadosh stated,
I got up about 5:15 in the morning and went into the yard. It was then about 20 minutes past 5, I should think. As I returned towards the back door, I heard a voice say no, just as I was going through the door. 3 or 4 minutes later, I returned to the yard, and the second time I went out, I heard something heavy fall against the fence.
He was asked if he wanted to look, but apparently he said he thought little of it. Monday, the 10th of September 1888, at the Working Lads Institute, Whitechapel Road, Mr. Wynne Baxter opened the inquiry into the circumstances attaining to the death of Annie Chapman, a widow whose body had been found horribly mutilated in the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street. At the inquest, the extent of Annie's injuries were read out by Dr. George Phillips.
On Saturday last, I was called by the police at 6:20 a.m. to 29 Hanbury Street and arrived at 6:30. I found the body of the deceased lying in the yard on her back, on the left hand of the steps that lead from the passage. The head was about 6 inches in front of the level of the bottom step, and the feet were towards a shed at the end of the yard. The left arm was across the left breast, and the legs were drawn up, the feet resting on the ground, and the knees turned outwards. The face was swollen and turned on the right side, and the tongue protruded between the front teeth, but not beyond the lips. It was much swollen. The small intestines and other portions were lying on the right side of the body on the ground above the right shoulder, but attached. There was a large quantity of blood, with a part of the stomach above the left shoulder. There was bruising on the face about the chin and sides of the jaw. I am of opinion that the person who cut the deceased's throat took hold of her by the chin from behind, and then commenced the incision from left to right.
The doctor was so disturbed by the damage done to Annie's corpse that he refused to go into explicit detail about the abdominal mutilations during the inquest. But under persuasion, he relented.
The abdomen had been entirely laid open. The intestines, severed from their mesenteric attachments, had been lifted out of the body and placed on the shoulder of the corpse, whilst from the pelvis, the uterus and its appendages, with the upper portion of the vagina and the posterior 2/3 of the bladder, had been entirely removed. No trace of these parts could be found, and the incisions were cleanly cut, avoiding the rectum and dividing the vagina low enough to avoid injury to the cervix uteri. Obviously, the work was that of an expert, of one at least, who had such knowledge of anatomical or pathological examinations as to be enabled to secure the pelvic organs with one sweep of the knife, which must have at least 5 or 6 inches in length, probably more. The appearance of the cuts confirmed to me in the opinion that the instrument, like the one which divided the neck, had been of a very sharp character. The mode in which the knife had been used seemed to indicate great anatomical knowledge, and in the time it would have taken, I think I can guide you by saying that I myself could not have performed all the injuries I saw on that woman and effect them, even without a struggle, under a quarter of an hour.
Inspector Joseph Chandler took to the stand to discuss the envelope found near Annie's head.
What was on the envelope?
On the back there was a seal with the words embossed in blue, Sussex Regiment. The other part was torn away. On the other side was the letter M in writing.
Any postage stamp?
No, there was a postal stamp, London, August the 3rd, 1888. That was in red. There was another black stamp which was indistinct.
Any other marks on the envelope?
There were also the letters SP lower down, as if someone had written Spitalfields. The other part was gone. There was no other marks.
Did you find anything else in the yard?
There was a leather apron lying in the yard, saturated with water. Next, 20-year-old James Kent was questioned, along with many other witnesses. He said, "She had some kind of handkerchief around her throat, which seemed soaked in blood. The face and hands were smeared with blood, as if she had struggled. She appeared to have been on her back and fought with her hands to free herself. The hands were turned up towards her throat, her legs were wide apart, and there were marks of blood upon them. The entrails were protruding and were lying across her left side. I got a piece of canvas from the shop to throw over the body." The inquest ended with a long statement from the coroner, concluding that the murderer was foreign, of dark complexion, over 40 years of age, a little taller than the deceased, of shabby genteel appearance, with a brown deerstalker hat on his head, and a dark coat on his back.
If your views accord with mine, you will be of opinion that we are confronted with a murder of no ordinary character, committed not from jealousy, revenge, or robbery, but from motives less adequate than the many which still disgrace our civilization, mar our progress, and blot the pages of our Christianity.
And a verdict of willful murder against a person or persons unknown was then entered. Annie was married and had a nice house, and was a respectable woman, spending money on nice things such as family portraits, which was almost a status thing at the time. But then the disabled son was sent to live in a home, and one of the two daughters died of meningitis. Annie and her husband turned to drink, and Annie was often seen wandering the countryside drunk and alone. And the couple separated, with Annie's husband paying her 10 shillings a week, which was a decent amount of money. But then Annie's husband dies, leaving her to live on the street. After her husband died, she no longer saw her surviving children, and she fell further into grief, leading people who knew her to call her Dark Annie, because of her visible sadness and depression. Living on the street, Annie made money begging, selling crochet and flowers. She also got clothes and some food from her mother and sister, but Annie couldn't live with them, as they were part of the temperance movement and were wholly against alcohol, which sadly Annie was now addicted to and could no longer give up. We know Annie was living at Crossingham's lodging house on Dorset Street, and in the night of her murder, people have claimed that she was out selling herself as a prostitute. But sources show a timeline. Annie is in the lodging house at midnight, sitting in the kitchen area, and at 12:30 she is joined by Frederick Stevens, who is a fellow lodger, and they share a beer together. At around 1 AM, slightly drunk, Annie leaves the lodging house to go to the Britannia pub to beg for food. At 1:45 she returns to the kitchen area of the lodging house and eats a baked potato. Around 2 AM, Annie is now quite drunk and has a disagreement with the lodging house manager, a Mr. Timothy Donovan, who wants money for renting a bed there. But Annie doesn't have the money to rent a bed for the night, and she leaves the lodging house, asking Mr. Donovan not to give her bed away, as she'll be back later with the money to pay. At 5:30 AM, Elizabeth Long states that she saw Annie standing outside 29 Hanbury Street with a man, and Elizabeth also claims she heard the man say, "Will you?" and Annie reply, "Yes." Now this is the evidence apparently that Annie was a prostitute, but when reporters and police probed all who knew her, asking if she was an immoral woman, the answer came back again and again, no, Annie Chapman was not a prostitute. And the question, "Will you?" could be anything, from passing on a message to making something out of crochet. But they needed Annie to fit into a box, and despite evidence against Annie and Mary being working girls, the police and press labelled them fallen women, and automatically, instead of Jack targeting women, he now only targets prostitutes. And this is in part again to the newspapers deliberately ramping up fear to sell more papers. For me personally, there is no evidence that at least 2 of Jack's victims were prostitutes. In fact, there is more evidence saying that they weren't. But the mindset of the time and the way women were treated made it easy for them to be tarnished. And it was down to the press at the time that created the story that the murderer was on a mission to clear the streets of London from wanton sinful women. But the only thing I see so far in Martha Tabram, Mary Ann Nichols and Annie Chapman are they are women down on their luck, and that they occasionally rough sleepers. You may think, why is this important, if they are prostitutes or not? Well, in my opinion, the victim's story should matter more than the hype of a psycho killer. And furthermore, it changes the course of the investigation, as the police are now looking in areas for an imaginary prostitute killer, when in reality, Jack the Ripper was just out looking for a woman. Any woman. Also, so far I feel that Jack the Ripper is a local man. All the murders up to now have been within half a mile of each other, and knowing and being comfortable in the area is key to the murders. For example, Annie Chapman was killed in a courtyard with only one way in and out, and police didn't start to take witness statements seriously, such as Harriet Hardman, the meat shop owner, when she said she heard whispering below the window, a painful moan, 2 or 3 gasps, and then silence. After giving this statement, she was never asked to go to the inquest. Although some things said at the inquest interest me, like James Kent. He said he covered the body with a piece of canvas, which was later found at the feet of the body of Annie. How much of the crime scene was messed with? Did the killer take the rings and stack the contents of the pockets by Annie's feet, or was that someone in the crowd? What else was moved? What else was taken? Also, as you might notice, the timing by Albert the carpenter and Elizabeth Long is off. But people in the area were extremely poor, and not many would have clocks or be able to afford pocket watches, so they told the time off the church bells, which also weren't very accurate. However, people believe it was actually the 5:15 bell that Elizabeth Long heard. And it's also believed if Albert looked over the fence, and if Elizabeth had waited a bit longer, both would have seen the face of Jack the Ripper. And to let you know about that leather apron that was found, there was a man called John Pfizer, a shoemaker known by the nickname Leather Apron, and a huge manhunt went out for him. He was arrested, but then later released due to lack of evidence. And again, the idea of a military man is suggested with the envelope, as you may remember the military connection with Martha Tabram. But let me know what you make of these murders in the comments below, and what you think of their lives, as in most cases, the victims become a footnote when the attacker reaches the levels of fame and notoriety as that of Jack. Thank you for listening, and join me for part 3, when one of those murders is not like the others. Thank you for listening. Take care.